Have you ever wondered about the origins of faith itself? We know Abraham as the patriarch, the great hero who trusted God with everything, but his story began in the most unlikely of places. It's a journey not of a man who simply had faith, but of a man who was chosen from a culture steeped in darkness, a world of clay idols and silent gods. He was Abraham, the son of Terah from Ur of the Chaldeans, and his life before God's call was nothing like you might imagine. This is the story of how a man, raised to worship what his hands had made, was called by the unseen hand of the Almighty to become the father of a great nation, a transformation that reveals the very heart of God's redemptive plan. It is a mystery that has puzzled believers for millennia. How does a person move from spiritual blindness to profound, unwavering trust? Prepare to have your understanding of faith itself utterly transformed as we uncover the astonishing journey of Abraham. To truly grasp Abraham's journey, we must first transport ourselves back to his world. The biblical narrative in Genesis 11 introduces us to Terah and his son Abram, placing them firmly in Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur was not a spiritual desert. On the contrary, it was a bustling, sophisticated center of culture and religion, but its religion was polytheistic and steeped in idol worship. The city was a major hub for the worship of the moon god Nana. This context is critical because it tells us that Abram's initial worldview was entirely shaped by the spiritual practices of his time and place. He wasn't a prophet in a cave. He was a man in a city, surrounded by altars, temples, and countless gods crafted by human hands. This makes God's direct call to him, and Abram's subsequent response, all the more radical. It wasn't a natural progression of faith. It was a sovereign, supernatural intervention. This parallels a profound theological truth found throughout Scripture. Salvation is a work of God's grace from beginning to end. Just as God called Abraham out of a culture of spiritual blindness, he calls us out of darkness into his marvelous light. The Apostle Paul, reflecting on this very idea in Ephesians 2:8-9, tells us, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." Abraham's story is a living testament to this truth, a divine rescue mission that would set the course for all of human history and reveal a new, intimate relationship with the one true God. This is a crucial lesson, for it reminds us that our faith, like Abraham's, is not something we conjure up on our own, but a gracious gift from the God who chooses to reveal himself to us, transforming us from idol worshippers into his children. The call that God gave to Abram was, at its core, a command to leave. It was not a suggestion or a vague invitation. It was a divine summons to abandon the known for the unknown. God spoke to him, not in a grand temple with 100 priests, but in the quiet of his spirit, and the command was simple yet terrifyingly profound. Leave your country, your people, and your father's family. Go to the land I will show you. Genesis 12:1, paraphrased. This single sentence contains the very essence of faith. Abram was not given a map, a detailed travel plan, or a guarantee of a smooth journey. He was given a promise and a destination that was, at that moment, unspecified. This is where the transformation from idol worshiper to man of faith truly begins. In his culture, the gods were tangible. They had temples, statues, and rituals. They were gods of a specific place, and their power was believed to be contained within their territory. By calling Abram to leave his land, God was commanding him to abandon not just his home, but his entire spiritual framework, to forsake the gods he could see for a God he could not. Imagine the internal conflict. It was a leap into a void of trust. He had to trust that this invisible God was powerful enough to protect him outside of his home city, strong enough to provide for him in a land he had never seen, and faithful enough to keep his word. This first step, the simple act of obedience to an incomprehensible command, was the crucible in which his faith was forged. He packed up his family, his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all his possessions, and set out. The journey was filled with hardship and uncertainty, yet the text simply states, "So Abram left as the Lord had told him." Genesis 12:4, paraphrased. There is no record of him demanding more details or seeking a sign. His response was one of radical, immediate, and unqualified obedience. He wasn't just a traveler. He was a pilgrim of faith, embarking on a physical journey that was a mirror image of his internal spiritual pilgrimage. This act established a foundational principle of the Christian walk. The path of faith often begins with an act of trusting God's command even when we don't have all the answers. It's the willingness to step out of our comfort zone and into the great unknown, relying solely on the character of the God who has called us. This story challenges the modern mind, which craves control and certainty. Abraham's journey reminds us that true faith is not the absence of questions, but the presence of an unwavering trust in the one who holds the future. If the call to leave Ur was the foundation of Abraham's faith, the command to sacrifice Isaac was its terrifying, ultimate test. This is arguably one of the most misunderstood stories in all of Scripture. It's often viewed through a lens of human ethics and psychology, which completely misses its profound spiritual and theological weight. God did not ask Abraham to simply give up something. He asked him to give up the very promise that defined his life. Isaac was the miracle child, the heir through whom God's promise of a great nation would be fulfilled. Sacrificing him would mean killing the future God himself had guaranteed. The temptation for Abraham was not just disobedience. It was to believe that God's promise was now void, that his word could fail. But instead of arguing with God or questioning his character, Abraham's faith had matured to the point where he believed God was sovereign even over death. The writer of Hebrews captures this beautifully, stating that Abraham believed that God could even raise the dead. Hebrews 11:19, paraphrased. He had learned that God's nature transcends human logic and that his promises, no matter how impossible they may seem, are secure. This act was the spiritual apex of his journey. When he raised the knife, it wasn't just a moment of obedience. It was an unqualified declaration that God's character and power were greater than any earthly reality or even any previous promise. The moment Isaac's life was spared, God provided a ram, a foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice to come. This event is not an endorsement of child sacrifice, but a powerful prefiguration of the gospel. It pointed forward to a future where God himself, as a loving father, would offer his one and only son, Jesus Christ, as a sacrifice for the sins of humanity. Unlike Abraham, God the Father would not hold back his son. This ultimate act of love and grace reveals the very nature of God, that he provides the sacrifice. Abraham's journey to Mount Moriah, the very same mountain range where Jesus would later be crucified, was a brutal and beautiful lesson in absolute surrender. It showed that the God who called him out of Ur was the same God who would not only provide for him, but would also become his ultimate provision. This is the heart of true faith, not just trusting God with our possessions or our journey, but with our deepest hopes, our most cherished dreams, and even our very life. So how does this profound story of Abraham apply to our lives today? First, we must recognize that we too come from our own Ur of the Chaldeans, a place of worldly comfort, self-reliance, and spiritual distraction. The call to faith is God's invitation for us to leave behind the idols we unknowingly worship, be they money, career, approval, or even our own abilities. The first practical step is to honestly assess what we've placed on the throne of our hearts and surrender it to God. Second, Abraham's first act of faith wasn't a grand, miraculous feat. It was a simple yet terrifying act of obedience, leaving home. For us, this might mean taking a step of faith that feels uncomfortable or illogical, trusting God's provision and guidance when the future is uncertain. This could be in our finances, our relationships, or our career. Third, Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac teaches us that faith grows when we're willing to release our most cherished possessions or plans back to God. What is your Isaac? The one thing you are holding onto so tightly that it prevents you from fully trusting God's plan for your life? The practical application is to lay that thing on the altar, trusting that God's plan is always better and that He will always provide. This is a daily discipline of prayer, surrendering our will to His and actively seeking His presence. It's about moving from a place of simply believing in God to truly trusting Him with the details of our lives. Abraham's story is far more than a historical account. It is the definitive roadmap for the journey of faith. It shows us that God's plan is not to find perfect people, but to transform imperfect people, like you and me, into reflections of His character. He took a man from a land of false gods and patiently, through a series of radical calls and impossible tests, forged a father of faith. This transformation was rooted in one central truth. Abraham learned to move beyond a faith of believing in God to a faith of believing God. He learned that God's promises are more solid than the ground beneath our feet, and His provision is more certain than our own foresight. So, what is your next step on this journey? Is God calling you to leave a comfortable place? Is He asking you to surrender something precious? Just as Abraham stepped out in faith, you too can trust the unseen hand of the Almighty. The path of faith is not about seeing the destination, but about trusting the one who is leading the way. How does Abraham's journey challenge or inspire your own faith today? Share your thoughts below and join the conversation.